2 recalls. By O. Henry. There remains 3 duties to be performed before the curtain falls upon the patched comedy. 2 have been promised. The third is no less obligatory. It was set forth in the program of this tropic vaudeville that it would be made known why Shorty O'Day, of the Columbia Detective Agency, lost his position. Also that Smith should come again to tell us what mystery he followed that night on the shores of Arcadia when he strewed so many cigar stumps around the coconut palm during his lonely night vigil on the beach. These things were promised. But a bigger thing yet remains to be accomplished, the clearing up of a seeming wrong that has been done according to the array of chronicled facts, truthfully set forth, that have been presented. And one voice, speaking, shall do these 3 things. 2 men sat on a stringer of a North River pier in the city of New York. A steamer from the tropics had begun to unload bananas and oranges on the pier. Now and then a banana or 2 would fall from an overripe bunch, and one of the 2 men would shamble forward, seize the fruit, and return to share it with his companion. One of the men was in the ultimate stage of deterioration. As far as rain and wind and sun could wreck the garments he wore, it had been done. In his person the ravages of drink were as plainly visible, and yet, upon his high-bridged Rubicon nose was jauntily perched a pair of shining and flawless gold-rimmed glasses. The other man was not so far gone upon the descending highway of the incompetence. Truly, the flower of his manhood had gone to seed that, perhaps, no soil might sprout. But there were still crosscuts along where he traveled through which he might yet regain the pathway of usefulness without disturbing the slumbering miracles. This man was short and compactly built. He had an oblique, dead eye, like that of a stingray, and the mustache of a cocktail mixer. We know the eye and the mustache. We know that Smith of the luxurious yacht, the gorgeous raiment, the mysterious mission, the magic disappearance, has come again, though shorn of the accessories of his former state. At his 3rd banana, the man with the nose glasses spat it from him with a shudder. "Deuce take all fruit," he remarked, in a patrician tone of disgust. "I lived for 2 years where these things grow. The memory of their taste lingers with you. The oranges are not so bad. Just see if you can gather a couple of them, O'Day, when the next broken crate comes up." "Did you live down with the monkeys?" asked the other, made tepidly garrulous by the sunshine and the alleviating meal of juicy fruit. "I was down there once myself, but only for a few hours. That was when I was with the Columbia Detective Agency. The monkey people did me up. I'd have my job yet if it hadn't been for them. I'll tell you about it. One day the chief sent a note around to the office that read, 'Send O'Day here at once for a big piece of business.' I was the crack detective of the agency at that time. They always handed me the big jobs. The address the chief wrote from was down in the Wall Street district. When I got there I found him in a private office with a lot of directors who were looking pretty fuzzy. They stated the case. The president of the Republic Insurance Company had skipped with about $1/10,000,000 in cash. The directors wanted him back pretty bad, but they wanted the money worse. They said they needed it. They had traced the old gent's movements to where he boarded a tramp fruit steamer bound for South America that same morning with his daughter and a big gripsack, all the family he had. One of the directors had his steam yacht cold and with steam up, ready for a trip, and he turned her over to me, carte blanche. In 4 hours I was on board of her, and hot on the trail of the fruit tub. I had a pretty good idea where old Warfield, that was his name, J. Churchill Warfield, would head for. At that time we had a treaty with about every foreign country except Belgium and that banana republic in Curia. There wasn't a photo of old Warfield to be had in New York. He had been foxy there, but I had his description. And besides, the lady with him would be a dead giveaway anywhere. She was one of the high flyers in society, not the kind that have their pictures in the Sunday papers. The real sort that open chrysanthemum shows and christen battleships. Well, sir, we never got a sight of that fruit tub on the road. The ocean is a pretty big place, and I guess we took different paths across it. But we kept going toward this Ancuria, where the fruiter was bound for. We struck the Monkey Coast one afternoon about 4. There was a ratty-looking steamer offshore taking on bananas. The monkeys were loading her up with big barges. It might be the one the old man had taken, and it might not. I went ashore to look around. The scenery was pretty good. I never saw any finer on the New York stage. I struck an American on shore, a big, cool chap, standing around with the monkeys. He showed me the consul's office. The consul was a nice young fellow. He said the fruiter was the Carlsfin, running generally to New Orleans, but took her last cargo to New York. Then I was sure my people were on board, although everybody told me that no passengers had landed. I didn't think they would land until after dark, for they might have been shy about it on account of seeing that yacht of mine hanging around. So, all I had to do was to wait and nab him when they came ashore. I couldn't arrest old Warfield without extradition papers, but my play was to get the cash. They generally give up if you strike him when they're tired and rattled and short on nerve. After dark I sat under a coconut tree on the beach for a while, and then I walked around and investigated that town some, and it was enough to give you the lions. If a man could stay in New York and be honest, he'd better do it than to hit that monkey town with 1,000,000. Dinky little mud houses, grass over your shoe tops in the streets, ladies in low neck and short sleeves walking around smoking cigars, tree frogs rattling like a hose cart going to a tin blow, big mountains dropping gravel in the backyards, and the sea licking the paint off in front. No, sir, a man had better be in God's country living on free lunch than there. The main street ran along the beach, and I walked down it, and then turned up a kind of lane where the houses were made of poles and straw. I wanted to see what the monkeys did when they weren't climbing coconut trees. The very first shack I looked in I saw my people. They must have come ashore while I was promenading. A man about 50, smooth face, heavy eyebrows, dressed in black broadcloth, looking like he was just about to say, "Can any little boy in the Sunday school answer that?" He was freezing on to a grip that weighed like a dozen gold bricks, and a swell girl, a regular peach, with a Fifth Avenue cut, was sitting on a wooden chair. An old black woman was fixing some coffee and beans on a table. The light they had come from a lantern hung on a nail. I went and stood in the door, and they looked at me, and I said, "Mr. Warfield, you are my prisoner. I hope, for the lady's sake, you will take the matter sensibly. You know why I want you." "Who are you?" says the old gent. "O'Day," says I, "of the Columbia Detective Agency. And now, sir, let me give you a piece of good advice. You go back and take your medicine like a man. Hand him back the boodle, and maybe they'll let you off light. Go back easy, and I'll put in a word for you. I'll give you 5 minutes to decide." I pulled out my watch and waited. Then the young lady chipped in. She was one of the genuine high-steppers. You could tell by the way her clothes fit and the style she had that Fifth Avenue was made for her. "Come inside," she says. "Don't stand in the door and disturb the whole street with that suit of clothes. Now, what is it you want?" 3 minutes gone, I said. "I'll tell you again while the other two tick off. You'll admit being the President of the Republic, won't you?" "I am," says he. "Well then," says I, "it ought to be plain to you. Wanted, in New York, J. Churchill Warfield, President of the Republic Insurance Company. Also the funds belonging to said company, now in that grip, in the unlawful possession of said J. Churchill Warfield." "Which," says the young lady, as if she was thinking, "you want to take us back to New York?" "To take Mr. Warfield. There's no charge against you, miss. There'll be no objection, of course, to your returning with your father." Of a sudden the girl gave a tiny scream and grabbed the old boy around the neck. "Oh, father, father," she says, kind of contralto, "can this be true? Have you taken money that is not yours? Speak, father." It made you shiver to hear the tremolo stop she put on her voice. The old boy looked pretty bughouse when she first grappled him, but she went on, whispering in his ear and patting his off shoulder till he stood still, but sweating a little. She got him to one side and they talked together a minute, and then he put on some gold eyeglasses and walked up and handed me the grip. "Mr. Detective," he says, talking a little broken, "I conclude to return with you. I have finished to discover that life on this desolate and displeased coast would be worse than to die itself. I will go back and hurl myself upon the mercy of the Republic Company. Have you brought a sheep?" "Sheep," says I haven't a single." "Ship," cut in the young lady. "Don't get funny. Father is of German birth and doesn't speak perfect English. How did you come up?" The girl was all broke up. She had a handkerchief to her face and kept saying every little bit, "0H, father, Father." She walked up to me and laid her lily-white hand on the clothes that had pained her at first. I smelt a million violets. She was a Lulu. I told her I came in a private yacht. "Mr. O'Day," she says. "Oh, take us away from this horrid country at once. Can you? Will you? Say you will." "I'll try," I said, concealing the fact that I was dying to get them on salt water before they could change their mind. One thing they both kicked against was going through the town to the boat landing. Said they dreaded publicity, and now that they were going to return, they had a hope that the thing might yet be kept out of the papers. They swore they wouldn't go unless I got them out to the yacht without anyone knowing it, so I agreed to humor them. The sailors who rowed me ashore were playing billiards in a barroom near the water, waiting for orders, and I proposed to have them take the boat down the beach half a mile or so, and take us up there. How to get them word was the question, for I couldn't leave the grip with the prisoner, and I couldn't take it with me, not knowing but what the monkeys might stick me up. The young lady says the old colored woman would take them a note. I sat down and wrote it, and gave it to the dame with plain directions what to do, and she grins like a baboon and shakes her head. Then Mr. Warfield handed her a string of foreign dialect, and she nods her head and says, "Si, senor," maybe 50 times, and lights out with the note. "Zero LD Augusta only understands German," said Miss Warfield, smiling at me. We stopped in her house to ask where we could find lodging, and she insisted upon our having coffee. She tells us she was raised in a German family in San Domingo. "Very likely," I said. "But you can search me for German words, except nix verste and noch einst." I would have called that "si, senor" French, though, on a gamble. Well, we three made a sneak around the edge of town so as not to be seen. We got tangled in vines and ferns and the banana bushes and tropical scenery a good deal. The monkey suburbs was as wild as places in Central Park. We came out on the beach a good half-mile below. A brown chap was lying asleep under a coconut tree with a 10-foot musket beside him. Mr. Warfield takes up the gun and pitches it into the sea. "The coast is guarded," he says. "Rebellion and plots ripen like fruit." He pointed to the sleeping man, who never stirred. "Thus," he says, "they perform trusts. Children." I saw our boat coming, and I struck a match and lit a piece of newspaper to show them where we were. In 30 minutes we were on board the yacht. The first thing, Mr. Warfield and his daughter and I took the grip into the owner's cabin, opened it up, and took an inventory. There was $105,000. United States Treasury notes in it, besides a lot of diamond jewelry and a couple of hundred Havana cigars. I gave the old man the cigars and a receipt for the rest of the lot, as agent for the company, and locked the stuff up in my private quarters. I never had a pleasanter trip than that one. After we got to see the young lady turned out to be the jolliest ever. The very first time we sat down to dinner, and the steward filled her glass with champagne, that director's yacht was a regular floating Waldorf. Astoria, she winks at me and says, "What's the use to borrow trouble, Mr. Flycop? Here's hoping you may live to eat the hen that scratches on your grave." There was a piano on board, and she sat down to it and sung better than you give up 2 cases to hear plenty times. She knew about 9 operas clean through. She was sure enough bon ton and swell. She wasn't one of the among others present kind. She belonged on the special mention list. The old man, too, perked up amazingly on the way. He passed the cigars and says to me once, quite chipper, out of a cloud of smoke, "Mr. O'Day, somehow I think the Republic Company will not give me the much trouble. Guard well the gripful of the money, Mr. O'Day, for that it must be returned to them that it belongs when we finish to arrive." When we landed in New York, I phoned to the chief to meet us in that director's office. We got in a cab and went there. I carried the grip and we walked in, and I was pleased to see that the chief had got together that same old crowd of moneybugs with pink faces and white vests to see us march in. I set the grip on the table. "There's the money," I said. "And your prisoner?" said the chief. I pointed to Mr. Warfield, and he stepped forward and says, "The honor of a word with you, sir, to explain." He and the chief went into another room and stayed 10 minutes. When they came back, the chief looked as black as a ton of coal. "Did this gentleman," he says to me, "have this valise in his possession when you first saw him?" "He did," said I. The chief took up the grip and handed it to the prisoner with a bow, and says to the director crowd, "Do any of you recognize this gentleman?" They all shook their pink faces. "Allow me to present," he goes on, "Senor Miraflores, President of the Republic of Arcadia. The senor has generously consented to overlook this outrageous blunder, on condition that we undertake to secure him against the annoyance of public comment. It is a concession on his part to overlook an insult for which he might claim international redress. I think we can gratefully promise him secrecy in the matter." They gave him a pink nod all round. "O'Day," he says to me, "as a private detective you're wasted. In a war, where kidnapping governments is in the rules, you'd be invaluable. Come down to the office at 11. I knew what that meant. "So that's the president of the monkeys," says I. Well, why couldn't he have said so? Wouldn't it jar you? Transients in Arcadia by O. Henry. There is a hotel on Broadway that has escaped discovery by the summer resort promoters. It is deep and wide and cool. Its rooms are finished in dark oak of a low temperature. Homemade breezes and deep green shrubbery give it the delights without the inconveniences of the Adirondacks. One can mount its broad staircases or glide dreamily upward in its aerial elevators, attended by guides in brass buttons, with a serene joy that Alpine climbers have never attained. There is a chef in its kitchen who will prepare for you brook trout better than the White Mountains ever served, seafood that would turn Old Point comfort, by gad, saw, green with envy, and Maine venison that would melt the official heart of a game warden. A few have found out this oasis in the July desert of Manhattan. During that month you will see the hotel's reduced array of guests scattered luxuriously about in the cool twilight of its lofty dining room, gazing at one another across the snowy waste of unoccupied tables, silently congratulatory. Superfluous, watchful, pneumatically moving waiters hover near, supplying every want before it is expressed. The temperature is perpetual April. The ceiling is painted in watercolors to counterfeit a summer sky across which delicate clouds drift and do not vanish as those of nature do to our regret. The pleasing, distant roar of Broadway is transformed in the imagination of the happy guests to the noise of a waterfall filling the woods with its restful sound. At every strange footstep the guests turn an anxious ear, fearful lest their retreat be discovered and invaded by the restless pleasure-seekers who are forever hounding nature to her deepest lairs. Thus, in the depopulated caravansary, the little band of connoisseurs jealously bide themselves during the heated season, enjoying to the uttermost the delights of mountain and seashore that art and skill have gathered and served to them. In this July, came to the hotel one whose card that she sent to the clerk for her name to be registered read, Madame Heloise D'Arcy Beaumont. Madame Beaumont was a guest such as the Hotel Lotus loved. She possessed the fine air of the elite, tempered and sweetened by a cordial graciousness that made the hotel employees her slaves. Bellboys fought for the honor of answering her ring. The clerks, but for the question of ownership, would have deeded to her the hotel and its contents. The other guests regarded her as the final touch of feminine exclusiveness and beauty that rendered the entourage perfect. This super-excellent guest rarely left the hotel. Her habits were consonant with the customs of the discriminating patrons of the Hotel Lotus. To enjoy that delectable hostelry one must forego the city as though it were leagues away. By night a brief excursion to the nearby roofs is in order, but during the torrid day one remains in the umbrageous fastnesses of the Lotus as a trout hangs poised in the pellucid sanctuaries of his favorite pool. Though alone in the Hotel Lotus, Madame Beaumont preserved the state of a queen whose loneliness was of position only. She breakfasted at 10, a cool, sweet, leisurely, delicate being who glowed softly in the dimness like a jasmine flower in the dusk. But at dinner was Madame's glory at its height. She wore a gown as beautiful and immaterial as the mist from an unseen cataract in a mountain gorge. The nomenclature of this gown is beyond the guess of the scribe. Always pale red roses reposed against its lace-garnished front. It was a gown that the head waiter viewed with respect and met at the door. You thought of Paris when you saw it, and maybe of mysterious countesses, and certainly of Versailles and rapiers and Mrs. Fiske and Rouget Noir. There was an untraceable rumor in the Hotel Lotus that Madame was a cosmopolite, and that she was pulling with her slender white bands certain strings between the nations in the favor of Russia. Being a citizeness of the world's smoothest roads, it was small wonder that she was quick to recognize in the refined purlieus of the Hotel Lotus the most desirable spot in America for a restful sojourn during the heat of midsummer. On the third day of Madame Beaumont's residence in the hotel, a young man entered and registered himself as a guest. His clothing, to speak of his points in approved order, was quietly in the mode. His features good and regular, his expression that of a poised and sophisticated man of the world. He informed the clerk that he would remain 3 or 4 days, inquired concerning the sailing of European steamships, and sank into the blissful inanition of the Nonpareil Hotel with the contented air of a traveler in his favorite inn. The young man, not to question the veracity of the register, was Harold Farrington. He drifted into the exclusive and calm current of life in the Lotus so tactfully and silently that not a ripple alarmed his fellow seekers after rest. He ate in the Lotus and of its patronym, and was lulled into blissful peace with the other fortunate mariners. In one day he acquired his table and his waiter, and the fear lest the panting chasers after repose that kept Broadway warm should pounce upon and destroy this contiguous but covert haven. After dinner on the next day, after the arrival of Harold Farrington, Madame Beaumont dropped her handkerchief in passing out. Mr. Farrington recovered and returned it without the effusiveness of a seeker after acquaintance. Perhaps there was a mystic freemasonry between the discriminating guests of the Lotus. Perhaps they were drawn one to another by the fact of their common good fortune in discovering the acme of summer resorts in a Broadway hotel. Words delicate in courtesy and tentative in departure from formality passed between the two, and, as if in the expedient atmosphere of a real summer resort, an acquaintance grew, flowered and fructified on the spot as does the mystic plant of the conjurer. For a few moments they stood on a balcony upon which the corridor ended, and tossed the feathery ball of conversation. "One tires of the old resorts," said Madame Beaumont, with a faint but sweet smile. "What is the use to fly to the mountains, or the seashore to escape noise, and dust when the very people that make both follow us there?" "Even on the ocean," remarked Farrington sadly, "the Philistines be upon you. The most exclusive steamers are getting to be scarcely more than ferry boats. Heaven help us when the summer resorter discovers that the Lotus is further away from Broadway than Thousand Islands or Mackinac." "I hope our secret will be safe for a week anyhow," said Madame, with a sigh and a smile. "I do not know where I would go if they should descend upon the dear Lotus. I know of but one place so delightful in summer, and that is the castle of Count Polinsky in the Ural Mountains." "I hear that Baden-Baden and Akin are almost deserted this season," said Farrington. "Year by year the old resorts fall in disrepute. Perhaps many others, like ourselves, are seeking out the quiet nooks that are overlooked by the majority." "I promise myself 3 days more of this delicious rest," said Madame Beaumont. "On Monday the Cedric sails." Harold Farrington's eyes proclaimed his regret. "I too must leave on Monday," he said, "but I do not go abroad." Madame Beaumont shrugged one round shoulder in a foreign gesture. "One cannot bide here forever, charming though it may be. The chateau has been in preparation for me longer than a month. Those house parties that one must give, what a nuisance! But I shall never forget my week in the Hotel Lotus." "Nor shall I," said Farrington in a low voice, "and I shall never forgive the Cedric." On Sunday evening, 3 days afterward, the two sat at a little table on the same balcony. A discreet waiter brought ices and small glasses of claret cup. Madame Beaumont wore the same beautiful evening gown that she had worn each day at dinner. She seemed thoughtful. Near her hand on the table lay a small chatelaine purse. After she had eaten her ice, she opened the purse and took out a $1 bill. "Mr. Farrington," she said, with the smile that had won the Hotel Lotus, "I want to tell you something. I'm going to leave before breakfast in the morning, because I've got to go back to my work. I'm behind the hosiery counter at Casey's Mammoth store, and my vacation's up at 8 o'clock tomorrow. That paper dollar is the last cent I'll see till I draw my $8 salary next Saturday night. You're a real gentleman, and you've been good to me, and I wanted to tell you before I went. I've been saving up out of my wages for a year, just for this vacation. I wanted to spend 1 week like a lady if I never do another one. I wanted to get up when I please instead of having to crawl out at 7 every morning, and I wanted to live on the best and be waited on and ring bells for things just like rich folks do. Now I've done it, and I've had the happiest time I ever expect to have in my life. I'm going back to my work and my little hall bedroom satisfied for another year. I wanted to tell you about it, Mr. Farrington, because I thought you kind of liked me, and I liked you. But, oh, I couldn't help deceiving you up till now, for it was all just like a fairy tale to me. So I talked about Europe and the things I've read about in other countries, and made you think I was a great lady. This dress I've got on, it's the only one I have that's fit to wear. I bought from O'Dowd and Amp, Levinsky on the installment plan. $75 is the price, and it was made to measure. I paid $10 down, and there to collect $1 a week till it's paid for. That'll be about all I have to say, Mr. Farrington, except that my name is Mamie Siviter instead of Madame Beaumont, and I thank you for your attentions. This dollar will pay the installment due on the dress tomorrow. I guess I'll go up to my room now. Harold Farrington listened to the recital of the Lotus's loveliest guest with an impassive countenance. When she had concluded, he drew a small book like a checkbook from his coat pocket. He wrote upon a blank form in this with a stub of pencil, tore out the leaf, tossed it over to his companion, and took up the paper dollar. "I've got to go to work, too, in the morning," he said, "and I might as well begin now. There's a receipt for the dollar installment. I've been a collector for O'Dowd and Amp, Levinsky for 3 years. Funny, ain't it, that you and me both had the same idea about spending our vacation? I've always wanted to put up at a swell hotel, and I saved up out of my 20 per and did it. Say, Mame, how about a trip to Coney Saturday night on the boat?" "What?" The face of the pseudo-Madame Heloise D'Arcy Beaumont beamed. "Oh, you bet I'll go, Mr. Farrington. The store closes at 12 on Saturdays. I guess Coney'll be all right even if we did spend a week with the swells." Below the balcony, the sweltering city growled and buzzed in the July night. Inside the Hotel Lotus, the tempered, cool shadows reigned, and the solicitous waiter single-footed near the low windows, ready at a nod to serve Madame and her escort. At the door of the elevator, Farrington took his leave, and Madame Beaumont made her last ascent. But before they reached the noiseless cage, B said, "Just forget that, Harold Farrington, will you? McManus is the name, James McManus. Some call me Jimmy." "Good night, Jimmy," said Madame. Transformation of Martin Burney by O. Henry. In behalf of Sir Walter's soothing plant, let us look into the case of Martin Burney. They were constructing the speedway along the west bank of the Harlem River. The grub boat of Dennis Corrigan, subcontractor, was moored to a tree on the bank. 22 men belonging to the little green island toiled there at the sinew-cracking labor. One among them, who wrought in the kitchen of the grub boat, was of the race of the Goths. Over them all stood the exorbitant Corrigan, harrying them like the captain of a galley crew. He paid them so little that most of the gang, work as they might, earned little more than food and tobacco. Many of them were in debt to him. Corrigan boarded them all in the grub boat and gave them good grub, for he got it back in work. Martin Burney was furthest behind of all. He was a little man, all muscles and hands and feet, with a gray-red, stubbly beard. He was too light for the work, which would have glutted the capacity of a steam shovel. The work was hard. Besides that, the banks of the river were humming with mosquitoes. As a child in a dark room fixes his regard on the pale light of a comforting window, these toilers watched the sun that brought around the 1 hour of the day that tasted less bitter. After the sundown supper, they would huddle together on the river bank and send the mosquitoes whining and eddying back from the malignant puffs of 23 reeking pipes. Thus socially banded against the foe, they wrenched out of the hour a few well-smoked drops from the cup of joy. Each week Burney grew deeper in debt. Corrigan kept a small stock of goods on the boat, which he sold to the men at prices that brought him no loss. Burney was a good customer at the tobacco counter. 1 sack when he went to work in the morning, and 1 when he came in at night. So much was his account swelled daily. Burney was something of a smoker. Yet it was not true that he ate his meals with a pipe in his mouth, which had been said of him. The little man was not discontented. He had plenty to eat, plenty of tobacco, and a tyrant to curse. So why should not he, an Irishman, be well satisfied? One morning as he was starting with the others for work, he stopped at the pine counter for his usual sack of tobacco. "There's no more for ye," said Corrigan. "Your account's closed. Ye are a losing investment. No, not even tobaccy, my son. No more tobaccy on account. If ye want to work on and eat, do so, but the smoke of ye has all ascended. 'Tis my advice that ye hunt a new job." "I have no tobaccy to smoke in my pipe this day, Mr. Corrigan," said Bernie, not quite understanding that such a thing could happen to him. "Earn it," said Corrigan, "and then buy it." Bernie stayed on. He knew of no other job. At first he did not realize that tobacco had got to be his father and mother, his confessor and sweetheart, and wife and child. For 3 days he managed to fill his pipe from the other men's sacks, and then they shut him off, one and all. They told him, rough but friendly, that of all things in the world tobacco must be quickest forthcoming to a fellow man desiring it, but that beyond the immediate temporary need requisition upon the store of a comrade is pressed with great danger to friendship. Then the blackness of the pit arose and filled the heart of Bernie. Sucking the corpse of his deceased Dedine, he staggered through his duties with his barrowful of stones and dirt, feeling for the first time that the curse of Adam was upon him. Other men bereft of a pleasure might have recourse to other delights, but Bernie had only 2 comforts in life. One was his pipe, the other was an ecstatic hope that there would be no speedways to build on the other side of Jordan. At meal times he would let the other men go first into the grub boat, and then he would go down on his hands and knees, groveling fiercely upon the ground where they had been sitting, trying to find some stray crumbs of tobacco. Once he sneaked down the river bank and filled his pipe with dead willow leaves. At the first whiff of the smoke, he spat in the direction of the boat and put the finest curse he knew on Corrigan, one that began with the first Corrigans born on earth and ended with the Corrigans that shall hear the trumpet of Gabriel blow. He began to hate Corrigan with all his shaking nerves and soul. Even murder occurred to him in a vague sort of way. 5 days he went without the taste of tobacco, he who had smoked all day and thought the night misspent in which he had not awakened for a pipeful or 2 under the bedclothes. One day a man stopped at the boat to say that there was work to be had in the Bronx Park, where a large number of laborers were required in making some improvements. After dinner Bernie walked 30 yards down the river bank away from the maddening smell of the others' pipes. He sat down upon a stone. He was thinking he would set out for the Bronx. At least he could earn tobacco there. What if the books did say he owed Corrigan? Any man's work was worth his keep. But then he hated to go without getting even with the hard-hearted screw who had put his pipe out. Was there any way to do it? Softly stepping among the clods came Tony, he of the race of Goths, who worked in the kitchen. He grinned at Bernie Elbow, and that unhappy man, full of race animosity and holding urbanity in contempt, growled at him. "What ye want, ye, Dago?" Tony also contained a grievance and a plot. He, too, was a Corrigan hater and had been primed to see it in others. "How you like Mr. Corrigan?" he asked. "You think him a nice man?" "To hell with him," he said. "May his liver turn to water and the bones of him crack in the cold of his heart. May dog fennel grow upon his ancestors' graves, and the grandsons of his children be born without eyes. May whiskey turn to clabber in his mouth, and every time he sneezes may he blister the soles of his feet. And the smoke of his pipe, may it make his eyes water, and the drops fall on the grass that his cows eat and poison the butter that he spreads on his bread." Though Tony remained a stranger to the beauties of this imagery, he gathered from it the conviction that it was sufficiently anti-Corrigan in its tendency. So, with the confidence of a fellow conspirator, he sat by Bernie upon the stone and unfolded his plot. It was very simple in design. Every day after dinner, it was Corrigan's habit to sleep for an hour in his bunk. At such times, it was the duty of the cook and his helper, Tony, to leave the boat so that no noise might disturb the autocrat. The cook always spent this hour in walking exercise. Tony's plan was this. After Corrigan should be asleep, he, Tony, and Bernie would cut the mooring ropes that held the boat to the shore. Tony lacked the nerve to do the deed alone. Then the awkward boat would swing out into a swift current and surely overturn against a rock there was below. "Come on and do it," said Bernie. "If the back of ye aches from the lick he gave ye as the pit of me stomach does for the taste of a bit of smoke, we can't cut the ropes too quick." All right, said Tony, but better wait about a 10-minute more. Give a Corrigan plenty time get good a sleep. They waited, sitting upon the stone. The rest of the men were at work out of sight around a bend in the road. Everything would have gone well, except, perhaps, with Corrigan, had not Tony been moved to decorate the plot with its conventional accompaniment. He was of dramatic blood, and perhaps he intuitively divined the appendage to villainous machinations as prescribed by the stage. He pulled from his shirt bosom a long, black, beautiful, venomous cigar, and handed it to Bernie. "You like a smoke while we wait?" he asked. Bernie clutched it and snapped off the end as a terrier bites at a rat. He laid it to his lips like a long-lost sweetheart. When the smoke began to draw, he gave a long, deep sigh, and the bristles of his gray-red mustache curled down over the cigar like the talons of an eagle. Slowly the red faded from the whites of his eyes. He fixed his gaze dreamily upon the hills across the river. The minutes came and went. "'Bout time to go now," said Tony. "That damn a Corrigan, he be in the reaver very quick." Bernie started out of his trance with a grunt. He turned his head and gazed with a surprised and pained severity at his accomplice. He took the cigar partly from his mouth, but sucked it back again immediately, chewed it lovingly once or twice, and spoke, in virulent puffs, from the corner of his mouth. "What is it, ye yaller hay then? Would ye lay contrivances against the enlightened races of the earth, ye instigator of illegal crimes? Would ye seek to persuade Martin Burney into the dirty tricks of an indecent dago? Would ye be for murderin' your benefactor, the good man that gives ye food and work? Take that, ye pumpkin-colored assassin." The torrent of Burney indignation carried with it bodily assault. The toe of his shoe sent the would-be cutter of ropes tumbling from his seat. Tony arose and fled. His vendetta he again relegated to the files of things that might have been. Beyond the boat he fled and away. He was afraid to remain. Bernie, with expanded chest, watched his late coplotter disappear. Then he, too, departed, setting his face in the direction of the Bronx. In his wake was a rank and pernicious trail of noisome smoke that brought peace to his heart and drove the birds from the roadside into the deepest thickets. Track to Doom by O. Henry, or The Mystery of the Rue de Péchot. 'Tis midnight in Paris. A myriad of lamps that line the Champs-Élysées and the Rouge et Noir cast their reflection in the dark waters of the Seine as it flows gloomily past the Place Vendôme and the black walls of the Convent Notre Dame. The great French capital is astir. It is the hour when crime and vice and wickedness reign. Hundreds of fiacres drive madly through the streets conveying women, flashing with jewels and as beautiful as dreams, from opera and concert. And the little bijou supper rooms of the Café Tout le Temps are filled with laughing groups, while bon mots, persiflage and repartee fly upon the air the jewels of thought and conversation. Luxury and poverty brush each other in the streets. The homeless gamin, begging a sou with which to purchase a bed, and the spendthrift roué, scattering golden louis d'or, tread the same pavement. When other cities sleep, Paris has just begun her wild revelry. The first scene of our story is a cellar beneath the Rue de Péchot. The room is filled with smoke of pipes and is stifling with the reeking breath of its inmates. A single flaring gas jet dimly lights the scene, which is one Rembrandt or Moreland and Kiesel would have loved to paint. A garçon is selling absinthe to such of the motley crowd as have a few sous, dealing it out in niggardly portions and broken teacups. Leaning against the bar is Carnignol Cachot, generally known as the Grey Wolf. He is the worst man in Paris. He is more than 4 feet 10 in height, and his sharp, ferocious-looking face and the mass of long, tangled gray hair that covers his face and head have earned for him the name he bears. His striped blouse is wide open at the neck and falls outside of his dingy leather trousers. The handle of a deadly-looking knife protrudes from his belt. One stroke of its blade would open a box of the finest French sardines. "Voila, Grey Wolf," cries Couteau, the bartender. "How many victims today? There is no blood upon your hands. Has the Grey Wolf forgotten how to bite?" "Sacre bleu, mille tonnerres, by George," hisses the Grey Wolf. "Monsieur Couteau, you are bold indeed to speak to me thus. By ventre Saint Gris, I have not even dined today. Spoils indeed. There is no living in Paris now. But one rich American have I garroted in a fortnight. Bah, those Democrats. They have ruined the country. With their income tax and their free trade, they have destroyed the millionaire business. Carambo, diable, it. Hist, suddenly says Chimunix the rag-picker, who is worth 20 million francs. Someone comes. The cellar door opened and a man crept softly down the rickety steps. The crowd watches him with silent awe. He went to the bar, laid his card on the counter, bought a drink of absinthe, and then drawing from his pocket a little mirror, set it up on the counter and proceeded to don a false beard and hair and paint his face into wrinkles until he closely resembled an old man 71 years of age. He then went into a dark corner and watched the crowd of people with sharp, ferret-like eyes. Grey Wolf slipped cautiously to the bar and examined the card left by the newcomer. "Holy St. Bridget!" he exclaims. "It is Tick-Tock, the detective." 10 minutes later, a beautiful woman enters the cellar. Tenderly nurtured and accustomed to every luxury that money could procure, she had, when a young vivandière at the convent of Saint Susan de la Montarde, run away with the Grey Wolf, fascinated by his many crimes and the knowledge that his business never allowed him to scrape his feet in the hall or snore. "Parbleu, Marie," snarls the Grey Wolf.
Que voulez-vous? Avez-vous le beau cheval de mon frère ou le joli chien de votre père?
"No, no, Grey Wolf," shouts the motley group of assassins, rogues, and pickpockets, even their hardened hearts appalled at his fearful words.
Mon Dieu!
"You cannot be so cruel." "Tiens!" shouts the Grey Wolf, now maddened to desperation, and drawing his gleaming knife. "Voilà, canaille."
Tout le monde, carte blanche en bon point sauf que peu entre nous revenez-nous à nous moutons.
The horrified sans-culottes shrink back in terror as the Grey Wolf seizes Maria by the hair and cuts her into 29 pieces, each exactly the same size. As he stands with reeking hands above the corpse, amid a deep silence, the old, gray-bearded man who has been watching the scene springs forward, tears off his false beard and locks, and Tick-Tock, the famous French detective, stands before them. Spellbound and immovable, the denizens of the cellar gaze at the greatest modern detective as he goes about the customary duties of his office. He first measures the distance from the murdered woman to a point on the wall. Then he takes down the name of the bartender and the day of the month and the year. Then, drawing from his pocket a powerful microscope, he examines a little of the blood that stands upon the floor in little pools. "Mon Dieu," he mutters, "it is as I feared human blood." He then enters rapidly in a memorandum book the result of his investigations and leaves the cellar. Tick-Tock bends his rapid steps in the direction of the headquarters of the Paris gendarmerie, but suddenly pausing, he strikes his hand upon his brow with a gesture of impatience. "Mille tonnerres," he mutters. "I should have asked the name of that man with the knife in his hand." It is reception night at the palace of the Duchess Valerie du Bellairs. The apartments are flooded with a mellow light from paraffin candles in solid silver candelabra. The company is the most aristocratic and wealthy in Paris. 3 or 4 brass bands are playing behind a portiere between the coal shed and also behind time. Footmen in gay-laced livery bring in beer noiselessly and carry out apple peelings dropped by the guests. Valerie, 7th Duchess du Bellairs, leans back on a solid gold ottoman on eiderdown cushions, surrounded by the wittiest, the bravest, and the handsomest courtiers in the capital. "Ah, madame," said the Prince Champvilliers, of Palms Royal, corner of 73rd Street. "As Montesquieu says, reign de plus bon tutti frutti youth seems your inheritance. You are tonight the most beautiful, the wittiest in your own salon. I can scarce believe my own senses when I remember that 31 years ago you—" "Saw it off," says the Duchess peremptorily. The prince bows low, and drawing a jeweled dagger, stabs himself to the heart. "The displeasure of your grace is worse than death," he says, as he takes his overcoat and hat from a corner of the mantelpiece and leaves the room. "Voila," says Bibi Francillon, fanning herself languidly. "That is the way with men. Flatter them, and they kiss your hand. Loose but a moment the silken leash that holds them captive through their vanity and self-opinionativeness, and the son of a gun gets on his ear at once. The devil go with him, I say." Ah, mon princesse, sighs the Count Pumpernickel, stooping and whispering with eloquent eyes into her ear. You are too hard upon us. Balzac says, all women are not to themselves what no one else is to another. Do you not agree with him? Cheese it, says the princess. Philosophy palls upon me. I'll shake you. Hosses, says the count. Arm in arm they go out to the Salon au Beurre. Armande de Fleury, the young pianissimo danseuse from the Folies Bergerac, is about to sing. She slightly clears her throat and lays a voluptuous cud of chewing gum upon the piano as the first notes of the accompaniment ring through the salon. As she prepares to sing, the Duchess du Bellairs grasps the arm of her ottoman in a vice-like grip, and she watches with an expression of almost anguished suspense. She scarcely breathes. Then, as Armande de Fleury, before uttering a note, reels, wavers, turns white as snow and falls dead upon the floor, the Duchess breathes a sigh of relief. The Duchess had poisoned her. Then the guests crowd about the piano, gazing with bated breath and shuddering as they look upon the music rack and observe that the song that Armande came so near singing is Sweet Marie. 20 minutes later, a dark and muffled figure was seen to emerge from a recess in the mullioned wall of the Arc de Triomphe and pass rapidly northward. It was no other than Tic-Toc, the detective. The network of evidence was fast being drawn about the murderer of Marie Cachot. It is midnight on the steeple of the Cathedral of Notre-Dame. It is also the same time at other given points in the vicinity. The spire of the cathedral is 20,000 feet above the pavement, and a casual observer, by making a rapid mathematical calculation, would have readily perceived that this cathedral is, at least, double the height of others that measure only 10,000 feet. At the summit of the spire there is a little wooden platform on which there is room for but one man to stand. Crouching on this precarious footing, which swayed dizzily with every breeze that blew, was a man closely muffled and disguised as a wholesale grocer. Old Francois Bienfalong, the great astronomer, who is studying the sidereal spheres from his attic window in the Rue de Bologna, shudders as he turns his telescope upon the solitary figure upon the spire. Sacre bleu, he hisses between his new celluloid teeth. It is Tic-Toc, the detective. I wonder whom he is following now. While Tic-Toc is watching with lynx-like eyes the hill of Montmartre, he suddenly hears a heavy breathing beside him, and turning, gazes into the ferocious eyes of the gray wolf. Cardinal Cachot had put on his W.U.Tel. company climbers and climbed the steeple.
Parbleu, monsieur, c'est Tic-Toc.
To whom am I indebted for the honor of this visit? The gray wolf smiled softly and depreciatingly. You are Tic-Toc, the detective, he said. I am. Then listen. I am the murderer of Marie Cachot. She was my wife, and she had cold feet and ate onions. What was I to do? Yet life is sweet to me. I do not wish to be guillotined. I have heard that you are on my track. Is it true that the case is in your hands? It is. Thank le bon Dieu, then. I am saved. The gray wolf carefully adjusts the climbers on his feet and descends the spire. Tic-Toc takes out his notebook and writes in it. At last, he says, I have a clue. Monsieur le Comte Cardinal Cachot, once known as the Grey Wolf, stands in the magnificent drawing room of his palace on East 47th Street. 3 days after his confession to Tic-Toc, he happened to look in the pockets of a discarded pair of pants and found 20 million francs in gold. Suddenly the door opens and Tic-Toc, the detective, with a dozen gendarmes, enters the room. You are my prisoner, says the detective. On what charge? The murder of Marie Cachot on the night of August 17th. Your proofs? I saw you do it, and your own confession on the spire of Notre-Dame. The count laughed and took a paper from his pocket. Read this, he said. Here is proof that Marie Cachot died of heart failure. Tic-Toc looked at the paper. It was a check for 100,000 francs. Tic-Toc dismissed the gendarme with a wave of his hand. We have made a mistake, messieurs, he said, but as he turns to leave the room, Count Cardinal stops him. One moment, monsieur. The Count Cardinal tears from his own face a false beard and reveals the flashing eyes and well-known features of Tic-Toc, the detective. Then, springing forward, He snatches a wig and false eyebrows from his visitor, and the gray wolf, grinding his teeth in rage, stands before him. The murderer of Marie Cachot was never discovered. Tommy's Burglar by O. Henry. At 10 o'clock p.m., Felicia, the maid, left by the basement door with the policeman to get a raspberry phosphate around the corner. She detested the police, man, and objected earnestly to the arrangement. She pointed out, not unreasonably, that she might have been allowed to fall asleep over one of St. George Rathbone's novels on the third floor, but she was overruled. Raspberries and cops were not created for nothing. The burglar got into the house without much difficulty, because we must have action and not too much descript, tie-in a 2,000-word story. In the dining room, he opened the slide of his dark lantern. With a brace and center bit, he began to bore into the lock of the silver closet. Suddenly a click was heard. The room was flooded with electric light. The dark velvet portieres parted to admit a fair-haired boy of 8 in pink pajamas, bearing a bottle of olive oil in his hand. "Are you a burglar?" he asked, in a sweet, childish voice. "Listen to that," exclaimed the man, in a hoarse voice.
"Ami a burglar."
"What do you suppose I have a 3 days' growth of bristly bread on my face for, and a cap with flaps? Give me the oil, quick, and let me grease the bit, so I won't wake up your mama, who is lying down with a headache and left you in charge of Felicia, who has been faithless to her trust." "Oh, dear," said Tommy, with a sigh. "I thought you would be more up-to-date. This oil is for the salad when I bring lunch from the pantry for you. And Mama and Papa have gone to the Metropolitan to hear Tereska. But that isn't my fault. It only shows how long the story has been knocking around among the editors. If the author had been wise, he'd have changed it to Caruso in the proofs." "Be quiet," hissed the burglar under his breath. "If you raise an alarm, I'll wring your neck like a rabbit's." "Like a chicken's," corrected Tommy. "You had that wrong. You don't wring rabbits' necks." "Aren't you afraid of me?" asked the burglar. "You know I'm not," answered Tommy. "Don't you suppose I know fact from fiction? If this wasn't a story, I'd yell like an Indian when I saw you, and you'd probably tumble downstairs and get pinched on the sidewalk." "I see," said the burglar, "that you're on to your job. Go on with the performance." Tommy seated himself in an armchair and drew his toes up under him. "Why do you go around robbing strangers, Mr. Burglar? Have you no friends?" "I see what you're driving at," said the burglar with a dark frown. "It's the same old story. Your innocence and childish insouciance is going to lead me back into an honest life. Every time I crack a crib where there's a kid around, it happens. Would you mind gazing with wolfish eyes at the plate of cold beef that the butler has left on the dining table?" said Tommy. "I'm afraid it's growing late." The burglar accommodated. "Poor man," said Tommy. "You must be hungry. If you will please stand in a listless attitude, I will get you something to eat." The boy brought a roast chicken, a jar of marmalade, and a bottle of wine from the pantry. The burglar seized a knife and fork sullenly. "It's only been an hour," he grumbled, "since I had a lobster and a pint of musty ale up on Broadway. I wish these story writers would let a fellow have a pepsin tablet, anyhow, between feeds." "My papa writes books," remarked Tommy. The burglar jumped to his feet quickly. "You said he had gone to the opera," he hissed, hoarsely and with immediate suspicion. "I ought to have explained," said Tommy. "He didn't buy the tickets." The burglar sat again and toyed with the wishbone. "Why do you burgle houses?" asked the boy, wonderingly. "Because," replied the burglar, with a sudden flow of tears, "God bless my little brown-bearded boy Bessie at home." "Ah," said Tommy, wrinkling his nose, "you got that answer in the wrong place. You want to tell your hard luck story before you pull out the child stop?" "Oh, yes," said the burglar, "I forgot. Well, once I lived in Milwaukee and—" "Take the silver," said Tommy, rising from his chair. "Hold on," said the burglar, "but I moved away. I could find no other employment. For a while I aged to support my wife and child by passing Confederate money, but, alas, I was forced to give that up because it did not belong to the Union. I became desperate and a burglar." "Have you ever fallen into the hands of the police?" asked Tommy. "I said burglar, not beggar," answered the cracksman. After you finish your lunch, said Tommy, and experience the usual change of heart, how shall we wind up the story? Suppose, said the burglar thoughtfully, that Tony Pastor turns out earlier than usual tonight, and your father gets in from Parsifal at 10:30. I am thoroughly repentant because you have made me think of my own little boy Bessie and, say, said Tommy, haven't you got that wrong? Not on your colored crayon drawings by B. Corey Kilvert, said the burglar. It's always a Bessie that I have at home, artlessly prattling to the pale-checked burglar's bride. As I was saying, your father opens the front door just as I am departing with admonitions and sandwiches that you have wrapped up for me. Upon recognizing me as an old Harvard classmate, he starts back in. Not in surprise, interrupted Tommy with wide, open eyes. He starts back in the doorway, continued the burglar, and then he rose to his feet and began to shout, rah, rah, rah. Well, said Tommy, wonderingly, that's the first time I ever knew a burglar to give a college yell when he was burglarizing a house, even in a story. That's one on you, said the burglar with a laugh. I was practicing the dramatization. If this is put on the stage, that college touch is about the only thing that will make it go. Tommy looked his admiration. You're on, all right, he said. And there's another mistalls you've made, said the burglar. You should have gone some time ago and brought me the $9 gold piece your mother gave you on your birthday to take to Bessie. But she didn't give it to me to take to Bessie, said Tommy, pouting. Come, said the burglar, sternly. It's not nice of you to take advantage because the story contains an ambiguous sentence. You know what I mean. It's mighty little I get out of these fictional jobs anyhow. I lose all the loot, and I have to reform every time. And all the swag I'm allowed is the blamed little falderols and luck pieces that you kids hand over. Why, in one story, all I got was a kiss from a little girl who came in on me when I was opening a safe. And it tasted of molasses candy, too. I've a good notion to tie this table cover over your head and keep on into the silver closet. Oh, no, you haven't, said Tommy, wrapping his arms around his knees. Because if you did, no editor would buy the story. You know you've got to preserve the unities. So VEU, said the burglar, rather glumly. Instead of sitting here talking impudence and taking the bread out of a poor man's mouth, what you'd like to be doing is hiding under the bed and screeching at the top of your voice. You're right, old man, said Tommy, heartily. I wonder what they make us do it for. I think the SPCC ought to interfere. I'm sure it's neither agreeable nor usual for a kid of my age to butt in when a full-grown burglar is at work and offer him a red sled and a pair of skates not to awaken his sick mother. And look how they make the burglars act. You'd think editors would know, but what's the use? The burglar wiped his hands on the tablecloth and arose with a yawn. Well, let's get through with it, he said. God bless you, my little boy. You have saved a man from committing a crime this night. Bessie shall pray for you as soon as I get home and give her orders. I shall never burglarize another house, at least not until the June magazines are out. It'll be your little sister's turn then to run in on me while I am abstracting the U.S. 4% from the tea urn and buy me off with her coral necklace and a falsetto kiss. You haven't got all the kicks coming to you, sighed Tommy, crawling out of his chair. Think of the sleep I'm losing. But it's tough on both of us, old man. I wish you could get out of the story and really rob somebody. Maybe you'll have the chance if they dramatize us. Never, said the burglar, gloomily. Between the box office and my better impulses that you're leading juveniles are supposed to awaken and the magazines that pay on publication, I guess I'll always be broke. I'm sorry, said Tommy, sympathetically, but I can't help myself any more than you can. It's one of the canons of household fiction that no burglar shall be successful. The burglar must be foiled by a kid like me, or by a young lady heroine, or at the last moment by his old pal, Red Mike, who recognizes the house as one in which he used to be the coachman. You have got the worst end of it in any kind of a story. Well, I suppose I must be clearing out now, said the burglar, taking up his lantern and brace-bit. You have to take the rest of this chicken and the bottle of wine with you for Bessie and her mother, said Tommy, calmly. But confound it, exclaimed the burglar, in an annoyed tone, They don't want it. I've got 5 cases of Chateau de Baixville at home that was bottled in 1853. That claret of yours is corked. And you couldn't get either of them to look at a chicken unless it was stewed in champagne. You know, after I get out of the story, I don't have so many limitations. I make a turn now and then. Yes, but you must take them, said Tommy, loading his arms with the bundles. Bless you, young master, recited the burglar, obedient. Second story Saul will never forget you. And now hurry and let me out, kid. Our 2,000 words must be nearly up. Tommy led the way through the hall toward the front door. Suddenly the burglar stopped and called to him softly. Ain't there a cop out there in front, somewhere sparking the girl? Yes, said Tommy. But what? I'm afraid he'll catch me, said the burglar. You mustn't forget that this is fiction. Great head, said Tommy, turning. Come out by the back door.